Welcome to part 4 of this mini-series on the visual effects available in the free version of Hitfilm. This time I'll be describing the effects in the blur collection. There are 8 effects in this collection, but one of these is only available in the Pro and Creator versions of Hitfilm. Some of the remaining 7 are relatively simple with few parameters, while others are not so simple, with many parameters. I won't be demonstrating all 7 in this part, and I'll concentrate on the simple ones first. Unless I state to the contrary, these effects can be used on the editor timeline or in a composite shot. If used on the editor timeline, the effect can only be applied from the control panel. If used in a composite shot, the effect can be applied from the control panel or from the composite shot layer properties. This is the simplest of the effects and creates a standard blur quickly. With the video on the editor timeline selected, I'll open up the controls panel and click the effects plus sign. Now I can use the search field to find the blur effect. As you can see, the default settings produce a light blur. There are 4 parameters for this effect, plus a preset drop-down list. I'll leave the preset list for now. The first parameter, radius, sets the intensity of the blur. How it achieves this is a little tricky to understand, but this is how I believe it works. The value in pixels determines the area around each pixel where that pixel merges with adjacent ones. The greater the radius, the greater the area of blur, which produces greater intensity. As well as using the slider or numeric input, the radius can be adjusted using the on-screen control. The iterations parameter has a smoothing effect on the blur. More iterations produces a smoother but bigger blur. The dimension parameter controls how the pixels are blurred. The default is both horizontal and vertical, but the drop-down allows blurring in either the horizontal or vertical. The final parameter, clamp to edge, determines how the blur behaves at the edges of the layer. With the checkbox enabled, the blur won't spill over the edge of the layer frame. To show you what I mean by that, I need to reduce the size of the layer. Now I'll remove the check mark. You can see that the blur spills over the edge of the frame. Now for the presets drop down. I'll select each of the 3 presets in turn to show the effect. This effect produces a blur that originates at a defined point and radiates outwards. Let's look at it in practice. I'm using the same video as I used in the blur effect. I'll now apply the effect by clicking the Effects plus sign. Now that the effect is applied, you can see that the default settings have applied a very slight blur around her head. Let's look at the effect properties. The preset drop-down arrow reveals 5 presets. I'll just select each in turn to demonstrate their effect. Now, it's fairly obvious that 3 of these presets are not really desirable. Of the 2 that are left, the basic preset seems to be the most effective. That's a matter of opinion, of course. If none of these presets suit you, adjustment of the effects parameters can get you what you want. I'll start with the strength parameter. This determines how strong the blur is. A setting of 0, unsurprisingly, produces no blur. Moving the slider in a positive direction increases the blur. Next is the quality parameter. This simply determines the quality of the blur, with 100% being best. Reducing this value reduces the quality and results in a breakdown of the blur. It's best to leave this at 100%, unless of course the breakdown effect is what you want. The center drop-down reveals a position parameter. This has 2 coordinates, x and y, and defines the center of the effect, where the blur radiates from. The default position is the center of the display, and is denoted by a small circle. You can reposition the center using this circle. or by adjusting the X and Y coordinates. Of course, these three parameters can be keyframed if so desired. This effect is similar to the zoom blur effect, but produces a circular blur. It also has presets. The effect has two parameters, position and angle. The position parameter functions the same as for the zoom blur effect. Moving the center moves the origin of the circular blur. The angle parameter controls how much circular blur is applied. With the angle parameter selected, there's a small on-screen control which can be used to modify the angle. It's rather small, so it's difficult to see. Another blur effect. It produces a straight blur that can be applied in any two-dimensional direction. The default direction is 0 degrees. It has 6 presets. There are 3 parameters. The angle parameter simply determines the angle of the blur direction. Like other angle parameters, it consists of a unit degree value on the right and a 360 degree modifier on the left. This angle value can also be adjusted using the on-screen control. Interesting results can be obtained by keyframing this parameter. The length parameter determines the length of the blur, and hence its strength. This also has an on-screen control in the form of a circle. Hover over any part of the circle's circumference until it is highlighted, then click and drag to adjust the length. I explained the clamp to edge property function when I dealt with the blur effect earlier. This effect is designed to create a soft focus appearance. It achieves this by duplicating the video event, then blurring this duplicate. It then blends the blurred duplicate back onto the original video. As I mentioned previously, to add an effect to an event on the editor timeline, you have to first open up the Controls tab. The effect can be added using the Insert 2D Effect icon. You can see that, with the default settings, it creates a softened version of the original. Now let's look at its properties. As you can see, there are 3 of these. I'll leave the one labelled preset for now. The 2 other parameters affect each other, and how they work is beyond the scope of this tutorial. Put simply, the radius parameter controls the strength of the blur, and the opacity parameter determines the opacity of the blurred duplicate. A thing to note about the radius slider. You'll find that the maximum radius you can get using this is 125. You can go higher by dragging the parameter value. The first parameter allows you to select a predetermined preset. There are 3 of these and their effect is self-explanatory. If you're not happy with the default settings, you can choose one of the presets. The diffuse effect is one that can be applied to a text string and animated to create an effective transition. I'll show how it can be used for a lower third intro. I've created a 10-second composite shot and added a text layer and a black plane layer. The black plane layer is simply there to remove the transparent background. I'll now open up the text layer entry, then add the diffuse effect. I'm going to set the radius to 270 and the opacity to 1. Now for the animation. I've described how to achieve this many times in previous episodes, but for the benefit of the transcript, I'll describe it again here. The playhead needs to be at the start of the timeline, and the keyframe enable icons for the two parameters have to be in their enabled state. This causes two keyframes to be created. Now the playhead is moved to the end of the timeline. This will create a 10-second animation. If you want a shorter animation, move the playhead to the desired time. The two parameters now need to be set to fully expose the text. I'll return the radius to its default value, which is 20. And because I want the text to be clear, I'll set the opacity value to 0. This latter statement may need some explanation. In other scenarios, we're used to an opacity of 0 resulting in transparency, and a maximum value resulting in full visibility. However, in this situation, the opacity parameter affects the blurred duplicate, not the original. So, a value of 0 makes the blurred duplicate transparent, resulting in a clear original. You'll see that two more keyframes are created where the playhead is. Now to play the animation. Here's a bit of a time saver. If you're not happy with where the last keyframes are and you want them to be somewhere else, simply lasso them with your mouse and drag them to a new position. A handy label appears as you drag, indicating the current position. Those are the 5 simplest of the blur effects collection. Next time I'll describe the other 2 effects, motion blur and lens blur. These are slightly more difficult to deal with, and I think will take up the whole of the tutorial. Join me then if you can. Bye for now.